It all began quietly, as most political storms do. There were murmurs in the hallways and cryptic posts online, hinting at something big brewing behind the scenes. But nothing could prepare Capitol Hill for what Representative Jasmine Crockett was about to lay bare. When she stepped into the chamber that day, carrying a red folder under her arm, few paid attention. She wasn't known for theatrics, and that made what followed all the more impactful. The session was routine at first. Committee reports, procedural motions, and partisan exchanges passed like clockwork. But then, Crockett stood and requested time on the floor under special privilege. She spoke calmly and deliberately, asking the speaker's permission to enter a set of documents into the congressional record. The moment she opened the folder, the tone in the chamber changed. She began by reading from a federal grant proposal, one that had initially seemed harmless. It was a rural development initiative, designed to support struggling counties in the Midwest. Kristi Noem, the governor-turned-congresswoman, had lobbied fiercely for these funds, touting them as a lifeline for small communities. She had testified, multiple times, about the program's legitimacy, its transparency, and her personal involvement in ensuring that every dollar was used ethically. But Crockett had something else in hand. What she read next stunned the room into silence. An internal memo, dated 6 months before the grant's approval, detailed conversations between Noem's office and a private contractor, one that later received a disproportionate amount of funding. The memo, written by a now-retired official, outlined concerns about Noem's insistence on bypassing the standard review process. The language was careful but clear. The decision was political, not procedural. Then came the emails. Crockett read excerpts from a chain that included top state officials and Noem's chief of staff. One email, in particular, stood out. It explicitly discussed redirecting portions of the grant to projects that had no connection to rural development but served political allies. One line read, "Governor wants this buried, no more chatter." Crockett paused before introducing a signed affidavit. It came from a former state financial officer who had worked closely with Noem's administration. The affidavit described how, upon raising concerns about the irregularities, he was warned against further inquiries and later reassigned without explanation. He claimed he had been instructed to destroy specific records, which he refused to do. Instead, he kept copies, which he later submitted under whistleblower protection. With methodical precision, Crockett laid out the timeline, the grant's conception, the irregular approval process, the flow of funds, and the pattern of suppression. She presented bank statements, procurement records, and testimonies from at least 3 individuals who corroborated the narrative. Each piece fit into a puzzle that had previously been obscured by political speeches and photo ops. But what made it even more serious was the contradiction between the evidence and Kristi Noem's prior testimony before Congress. On 2 occasions, she had assured committees under oath that she had no role in selecting contractors and that all funds were allocated through competitive legal channels. The documents Crockett presented told a very different story. The final document was an internal audit summary never released, publicly showing that nearly 40% of the grant had been routed to entities with no direct connection to the program's goals. One of those entities had ties to a political action committee that supported Noem's congressional run. As the session ended, no one spoke for a moment. It wasn't the usual political ambush or partisan bickering. Jasmine Crockett hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't needed to. She simply followed the facts. And those facts painted a picture of deliberate misuse of federal funds, followed by an orchestrated effort to cover it up. Even Kristi Noem's closest allies were caught off guard. Her office scrambled to issue a statement that evening, calling the allegations baseless, but by then, the damage was already done. Multiple outlets had picked up the story, and lawmakers across the aisle were calling for this investigation. What Crockett had done wasn't dramatic. It was surgical. She'd taken what many suspected but couldn't prove, and she brought the proof forward in full view of the nation. The fallout from Jasmine Crockett's revelations didn't take long to surface. As reporters swarmed Capitol Hill and congressional offices buzzed with tension, the next phase of the scandal unfolded with chilling clarity. While the initial shock had come from the documents Crockett exposed, what truly shook the foundation was the depth of contradiction between that evidence and the sworn testimony Kristi Noem had previously delivered. Months before the red folder ever appeared, Kristi Noem had sat confidently before a congressional subcommittee. She answered questions about federal development grants specifically, the ones distributed in her home state under her watch. In her statement, she emphasized transparency, impartiality, and her lack of involvement in direct allocation decisions. She looked members of Congress in the eye and claimed the entire process had followed the letter of the law. There had been no special treatment, no political considerations, just a streamlined, merit-based system designed to help rural America. But Crockett's presentation tore those claims apart line by line. With every email she read aloud, every procurement documents she cited, it became increasingly evident that Noem had misled Congress under oath. Her prior denials now stood in stark contrast to written communication, clearly showing her office's involvement in selecting contractors, approving deviations from guidelines, and actively participating in steering funds toward preferred vendors. *1. Particularly damning moment came when Crockett presented a set of calendar entries and meeting transcripts. These records showed Kristi Noem had participated in at least 3 private meetings with representatives of a contractor, who later received over $4 million in grant funding. That same contractor was not even on the approved vendor list at the time of their selection, yet somehow, after those private meetings, their proposal was fast-tracked and approved. Despite scoring lower than multiple competing bids, Crockett didn't need to editorialize. She simply read Noem's earlier testimony where she declared, "I have never personally met with or influenced the selection of any grant recipient." That quote echoed in the chamber as Crockett held up the transcript from one such meeting, time-stamped and witnessed by a senior aide. Noem's defenders tried to push back, suggesting perhaps the governor had been misinformed or that staffers had acted independently. But the paper trail made those arguments impossible to sustain. The most troubling parts came from the whistleblower affidavits, statements from former state employees who described in detail how they were told to alter financial logs and scrub metadata from emails before submitting them for public records requests. One whistleblower described how he was asked to sanitize a document trailed to match the governor's talking points. Crockett connected these manipulations to the pattern of obstruction Noem had denied. During a prior oversight hearing, she had been asked directly whether her office had ever instructed staff to modify or suppress documents. Her answer had been immediate and unequivocal: absolutely not. Yet now, Crockett was showing the chamber sworn statements that directly refuted that claim, paired with audit logs showing when the data was changed and by whom. In one instance, metadata showed a file had been edited mere hours after a staff meeting Noem had chaired. The gravity of these contradictions went beyond political embarrassment. Under federal law, knowingly making false statements to Congress is a criminal offense. What Crockett had laid bare wasn't just poor oversight or political favoritism, it was the appearance of perjury. The committee had no choice but to take it seriously. Within days, legal analysts and ethicists began appearing on national broadcasts, comparing the situation to historical precedents. Congressional leaders, both Democratic and Republican, expressed concern not just about the alleged misconduct, but about the breach of trust inherent in lying to a legislative body. It didn't take long before calls for a formal inquiry began surfacing in both chambers. Kristi Noem herself attempted damage control. Her office released a brief statement claiming misinterpretation and misgestation, suggesting Crockett was playing politics, but that defense didn't hold up against the volume and consistency of documentation now in public view. Crockett, meanwhile, stayed largely silent outside of the chamber. She didn't grandstand. She let the evidence do the talking. And that evidence showed a powerful official saying one thing under oath while doing the exact opposite behind closed doors. Once Jasmine Crockett's revelations were laid out before Congress, the wheels of formal accountability began turning faster than anyone had anticipated. What began as a thunderous moment on the House floor quickly escalated into a ethics investigation. The bipartisan House Ethics Committee, long criticized for its sluggish pace and partisan deadlock, moved with rare urgency. They had no choice. The volume and credibility of the evidence Crockett introduced left little room for delay. The committee's first step was to formally subpoena all records referenced in the folder Crockett submitted. They also requested additional documentation from federal grant offices, state agencies in South Dakota, and communications between Kristi Noem and her staff dating back 2 years. While Noem had once been viewed as a rising conservative star, suddenly the very structure she had leaned on, her connections, her record, and her reputation was under inspection. Publicly, Noem maintained a firm front. She denied wrongdoing and dismissed the investigation as politically motivated. But behind the scenes, her office was inundated with document requests, witness interviews, and legal consultations. The committee wanted everything: emails, text messages, internal memos, even visitor logs from the governor's mansion during her final year in office. And as the records rolled in, the picture they painted was damning. It wasn't just one or two incidents. The Ethics Committee quickly discovered a pattern of behavior spanning months. Federal funds intended for rural economic development were routinely funneled into side projects that had little to no connection to the grant's original purpose. Several recipients of the diverted funds were businesses or individuals who had made substantial donations to political organizations affiliated with Kristi Noem. In one glaring example, a single contractor received $1.2 million to construct public-use facilities that, in reality, turned out to be luxury cabins on private land owned by a Noem campaign donor. What shocked investigators wasn't just the misuse of funds, but the paper trail suggesting deliberate concealment. Staffers in Noem's office had engaged in what one investigator described as systematic sanitization of communications. Language in emails was carefully adjusted to omit incriminating terms. Contracts were backdated, and in multiple cases, audit trails showed documents being altered or deleted hours after. Congressional inquiries began circulating internally. It was this context that made the bipartisan nature of the Ethics Committee's response so unusual. Several Republican members, who had once worked alongside Noem or praised her governance, could no longer defend the narrative she had built. When confronted with email evidence contradicting her sworn statements, even her allies began to retreat. From public support, Crockett was asked to return to the committee as a cooperating witness. She answered questions not just about the documents she presented, but about how she obtained them, the process she followed for verification, and why she had waited to bring them forward. Her answers were clear and methodical. She had received the information from protected whistleblowers, verified it through independent channels, and submitted it only after confirming the integrity of every claim. The committee's interim report, released just 2 weeks into the investigation, was blistering. It concluded that Kristi Noem had knowingly misrepresented material facts during sworn testimony to Congress, and that federal resources were misused in ways that raised serious questions of legal and ethical violations. The report also noted that her actions had compromised the integrity of congressional oversight and the responsible management of taxpayer funds. Though final recommendations had not yet been issued, the mood within the House had shifted. What had begun as skepticism toward Jasmine Crockett's bold move turned into respect even from those across the aisle. She had not only exposed misconduct, but she had done so in a way that forced even hardened partisans to confront the facts. For Noem, the political damage was immediate and deep. Major news outlets began unearthing past reports of questionable financial decisions in her administration. Former staffers who had remained silent now started speaking to investigators, corroborating the details Crockett had presented, and with each day, the Ethics Committee's case grew more comprehensive. The process wasn't rushed, but it was decisive. Noem was granted opportunities to respond, submit counter-evidence, and testify. But even her own submissions were riddled with contradictions and half-explanations. The truth, once buried in bureaucratic language and red tape, was now laid bare by a methodical inquiry that owed its spark to Jasmine Crockett's relentless commitment to exposing the truth. The vote didn't come easily. It was historic, controversial, and deeply uncomfortable for many lawmakers on both sides of the aisle. Expelling a sitting member of Congress is a rare and consequential act, one reserved for only the most serious violations of trust and duty. And yet, after weeks of mounting evidence, committee hearings, and intense public scrutiny, the House reached the conclusion that Kristi Noem's continued presence in Congress could no longer be justified. It was Jasmine Crockett's calm but unrelenting presentation that had sparked the chain of accountability. But the final vote belonged to the institution as a whole. Leading up to the vote, the House Ethics Committee released its full report, more than 300 pages long. The findings were unambiguous. Kristi Noem had knowingly misused federal funds, steered contracts toward political allies, and misled Congress under oath, an act that constituted perjury. The committee also cited obstruction of justice, noting that her office had tampered with records and intimidated potential witnesses during the early stages of the investigation. As the date for the floor vote approached, debate intensified behind closed doors. Some Republican lawmakers argued that expulsion was too severe, that a censure or suspension would be more appropriate. Others, including moderate voices from both parties, pointed out that failing to act decisively would send a dangerous message that the rules only apply to those without political protection. Even lawmakers who once publicly supported Noem were now distancing themselves, wary of becoming collateral damage in what had become a high-profile scandal. Kristi Noem herself didn't speak in the final debate session. Her legal team had advised against it. The last time she had spoken before the chamber months earlier, under oath her words had been dissected and disproven piece by piece. Instead, her seat remained empty as members took to the floor, one after another, to express frustration, sadness, and ultimately, resolve. It wasn't about politics anymore. It was about credibility, and Jasmine Crockett's meticulous handling of the situation had made that distinction painfully clear. Crockett didn't speak at length during the vote session either. She had already said what needed to be said, through evidence and documents, through transparency and patience. When asked by a reporter outside the chamber whether she felt vindicated, she simply replied, "It's not about me. It's about protecting the truth." The final tally stunned the nation, with 278 votes in favor and 157 against. Kristi Noem was officially expelled from the United States Congress. It was the first expulsion in over 2 decades and only the 6th in American history. Noem, once a rising figure in conservative politics, was now removed not because of a partisan vendetta, but because the facts left no room for ambiguity. Asterisk, the reaction across the country was immediate. Supporters of Noem decried the vote as a political witch hunt, but their claims rang hollow against the mountain of evidence. Even conservative editorial boards acknowledged that her actions had crossed a line that could not be ignored. Legal experts weighed in on next steps, noting that criminal charges could follow based on the Ethics Committee's referral to the Justice Department. Asterisk, what made the expulsion even more impactful was the tone it set. It reminded every member of Congress that misconduct, no matter how carefully concealed, could still be exposed, and that truth, when wielded without malice but with precision, could pierce through the strongest political armor. Jasmine Crockett's role had not been to grandstand or seek glory. Instead, she followed procedure, honored the voices of whistleblowers, and brought to light a case that many had suspected, but few had dared to confront. Asterisk, Noem's departure was quiet. There were no cameras at the Capitol steps when she left her office for the last time. Her staff had cleared out days earlier, and her nameplate was removed within hours of the vote. As her former colleagues returned to the floor, the atmosphere was somber, not because she had been mistreated, but because the chamber had been forced to expel one of its own. Asterisk, in the end, the vote to remove Kristi Noem was less about partisan victory and more about institutional self-preservation. A body that had too often been accused of shielding its members had finally acted decisively. And though it was Jasmine Crockett who lit the fuse, it was the collective conscience of the House that carried the decision to its final, irreversible conclusion. In the days following Kristi Noem's expulsion, the political landscape remained unsettled. News outlets dissected every detail. Analysts debated the long-term fallout, and ordinary citizens weighed what it all meant for the integrity of the institutions they relied on. The event wasn't just a scandal, it was a signal that even the most powerful could be held accountable when truth was brought forward with clarity and purpose. Asterisk, Jasmine Crockett emerged from the ordeal not as a partisan warrior, but as a public servant who had taken her oath seriously. She didn't posture for attention. She didn't fan the flames of controversy. She followed the trail of evidence, stood by the whistleblowers who came forward, and trusted that the process, if guided by truth, would do the rest. And it did. The quiet confidence she carried throughout the proceedings earned her not just headlines, but respect, even from those who didn't share her politics. Asterisk, what this episode revealed, more than anything, was the fragility and strength of public trust. Fragile because a single elected official could manipulate systems meant to help the vulnerable. Strong because others within those same systems had the courage to expose it. For every staffer who risked their career to speak out, for every investigator who followed leads rather than pressure, and for every legislator who voted based on conscience rather than party, the process worked painfully, slowly, but undeniably. Asterisk, Kristi Noem's fall from grace wasn't just the result of a bad decision. It was a culmination of choices made in secrecy, of power used without transparency, and of confidence that accountability would never catch up. But it did. The documents didn't lie. The people behind the scenes, once silenced, spoke louder through Crockett's voice than any press conference ever could. And when the time came, even some of Noem's staunchest allies had to acknowledge that defending the indefensible wasn't a path they could follow. Asterisk, the story ended not with celebration, but with a sober reminder. Public office is a trust, not a throne. Every vote cast in Congress, every dollar allocated, every statement made under oath carries weight. Violating that trust may take time to surface, but when it does, the consequences are real. Asterisk, Jasmine Crockett's actions didn't just remove one member of Congress, they renewed a principle. That accountability still exists, that facts still matter, and that leadership sometimes means doing the hard thing when no one else will. It was a lesson the chamber won't soon forget, neither will the